Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to Locker Room, Southland's podcast for men. A lot of women listen, John. But we don't change. We don't alter our course.
That's good.
Talk about man stuff.
That's
if
great.
The women, if the ladies want to listen in.
I probably wouldn't be a good person to interview about the other stuff, so.
No, but it might be fun sometime.
You get a lot of old man opinions.
It probably wouldn't go well for either one of us. Well, it's our podcast for men. We try to talk about the right things in the right way, which men are not always known to do, and especially in locker rooms. And so that's the story on the name there. But we have been in this season of Locker Room talking all about marriage. Man, I think it's been really good. I think it's been really helpful. It's been awesome to get different perspectives from different men and different things that arise in marriage. And so we wanted to have you on to talk about just kind of a recap of all these different topics. And so today I'm going to kind of hit you with some of these questions I gave you ahead of time just to kind of think about a little bit. But real quick, I mean, a lot of people who are part of our church, know this, but maybe just talk about your marriage just briefly and, how did you guys meet, and tell us about Allison and all that
Absolutely.
kind of thing.
So been married 21 years. Met Allison here in the break room. We were both interns. She was in the children's department. I was in the college department. She walked into Staples something and it was lights out. Like I knew right then, I was like, this is the woman I'm going to marry. I don't know that she was that convinced in that moment, but I was. So we ended up working in Haiti together. Different paths led us there, and our friendship grew the very first year. We weren't really technically allowed to date on staff.
But notice the word technically.
Technically. So at the very end, I kind of broke the rule and said, hey, I have interest. She had interest, and she came back to school here in the States to wrap up a degree, and I stayed down there. So we emailed for 2 years, and that was kind of our dating relationship. I don't recommend that.
That was when email was like a new thing.
Yeah,
too.
It was like a dinosaur. So I'd get like 2 a week,
right.
Because we were on ham radios down there. And so the longest we ever spent together was on our honeymoon. We were sitting on a beach, and I realized, like, we've never spent more than a couple of days together as a couple. And so then we were married. So I don't know that that's like the orthodox way to get married, but worked for us. And here we are, 2 kids, daughter's a freshman in college. My son's a sophomore in high school.
Yeah. Well, and you and I both have wives named Allison and sons named Silas. So if at any point in this conversation we have to clarify who and what we're talking about, we'll try to do that well for everybody listening. But you and I both have talked about, both on stage and kind of to anyone who will listen, and advised people to pursue marriage early on, and to pursue having lots of kids. And that tends to stand in stark contrast to a lot of other messages out there right now. So why do you feel it's important to say that publicly? There's a lot of things you and I kind of think, when we're and talk about, but there's other things that we'll say publicly, you know. So why is that important?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's one of the very first gifts that God gives people. He gave it to Adam and Eve and said, be fruitful and multiply. And they obeyed. And out of that, there was some blessing. Obviously, they messed some things up too. I think the other reason is I'm from a big family. Yeah. And over the years, I've seen the blessing and benefit. We were encouraged to get married young and encouraged to have as many kids as we could. And now, I'm a part of this massive extended family that, I absolutely love being a part of. And I think if you contrast the family I'm from and the family I lead on my own with culture, you would see a very different set of scenarios. And so if you're comparing the two, I think most people would be drawn to what I have as opposed to what the culture is offering. And so even if you didn't have the Bible as your authority in life, I think you could just look at the two and go, wow, man, if you do what God says, you're going to have blessing and benefit for generations to come. I think, too, one of the other motivating factors for me in saying it frequently to every couple I meet is our culture is delaying a lot of stuff. So more and more young people are delaying things that generations before did early on in life. And I'm convinced that there are certain lessons in life that you cannot learn apart from marriage and parenting. And there are certain blessings in life that you cannot receive apart from marriage and parenting. And so when we look at how our culture is becoming more and more self-centered, one of the best ways to combat that is to do selfless things. And I can tell you, and you can say this and validate it from experience, if you do marriage right and parenting right, it's the most selfless thing you can ever do. It's just not about you. So it causes you to crucify a lot of things that probably wouldn't get crucified in life unless you jumped into it. So I'm a big believer in that's the best classroom, is to just go, jump in feet first and be a part of it, and you'll learn some really good lessons.
Yeah, there's a lot of lessons that get learned at 2:00 in the morning when you've changed what feels like the 100th diaper of the day.
Yes.
And you realize internally, wow, I've got some serious selfishness that needs to be, to your point, crucified. And that's one of the crucibles that God uses to help reveal those things in us and then to push through.
That's right.
So, you referenced, this wasn't in the list of questions I gave you, but you referenced you grew up in a big family. Mm-hmm. I did not. It was me and my mom.
Yeah.
And so it's funny because when my whole crew roll into church, you sit there and just kind of chuckle in ways because you like it's like you know what that's a familiar feeling to you and you love it. And so I've had to grow into that, whereas I came into marriage thinking 2 kids. That's what I said to Al. He's like, man, 2, that's double what I was. That seems like a lot. And she's like, well, I think 4 or 5 is a better idea. And it's not hard to convince me to, the process of making babies, So she won the day on that one, but I don't have any regrets around it at all, which it's just fun to be in that. At times it feels like chaos and craziness, but there's, again, something to be said for, and we all are in this together, and you're going to do things that get on my nerves, and I'm going to do things that get on your nerves, and we got to figure this out, how to live together, and conflict resolution, all those things that happen. And man, the longer you go without that, the harder those lessons become to learn.
Yeah, I think part of the reason, too, our culture struggles in understanding God is we've become anti-children. Mm-hmm. And so we're so me-oriented. I need me time, and I need, all this stuff. It's all self-centered. So kids are one of the clearest pictures of God that we have left on earth. They're the picture of innocence. So as we continue to just put kids down and talk about them being a burden instead of a blessing, we're losing culturally a view of God that I think is really important to the church and to every person in society. So that's another reason I'm a big fan of let's bring lots of kids into the world and let's take good care of them.
Yeah. So we've talked about kind of the general, way that God has approached this with us and said, be fruitful, multiply, it's a gift, marriage, children. And then, you and I experience this a lot. Whenever we talk about those big kind of broad categories and generalities, this is what God seems to be doing and revealing in his will and word to be true for most people. Every now and then we'll have people go, well, what about, and sometimes when it's not a real black and white, I mean, there's not a thou shalt get married by the age of 21 and have 2.8 children,
Absolutely.
Rule in the Bible. So can you imagine some scenarios where if a young couple came to you or a young person came to you and said, I'm actually thinking about delaying marriage, or a couple that says, actually, we're thinking about waiting to have children a little longer than normal, or what you may say should be normal. What can you imagine what those scenarios might be that would seem wise to you?
Yeah, the overarching theme I would apply to it would be you're just not a devoted follower of Jesus. That would be true for me in any circumstance. So I would just tell people, if you're not committed to Jesus and to the authority of Scripture, I don't think you should be married, period, because you're not going to be able to die to self and serve and sacrifice for your spouse or your kids. Yeah. So you know the person you're potentially going to get married to or are married to. Man, if Jesus isn't King and Center, Lord, and I don't think that'd be a wise move at all. And so to me, that's the main primary banner. I think our culture emphasizes things like, well, I don't have a good job, I don't have the resources. I can understand those tension points, or I have a lot of debt. I hear that a lot. There's some responsibility things you probably need to make sure you have a plan for before you jump in. But I think those things become crutches and excuses too often. And, exceptions are never good rules. And as a culture, that's what we tend to do, is just only look at exceptions and allow those to become the rules that govern how we do just about everything anymore. Yeah. So I'm not a big believer in that. I just tend to think, man, you were created to be in a relationship with a person of the opposite sex. So take that on seriously and run with it. Don't be afraid of it. You're going to have fear. I mean, you know this. When I got engaged, when you got engaged, there was hesitation. And there should be some level of, okay, this is a big responsibility I'm taking on. I don't want you to take that lightly. Yeah. But the only way you're going to get over that fear is by just diving in.
Yeah, the remedy to the fear of responsibility is not to avoid the responsibility. Right. The remedy to the fear of responsibility is to take it on.
Yeah.
So you bring up a great point, too, in that if the essence of marriage is to be a kind of a divine reenactment of Christ and the church, then to pursue marriage apart from understanding that authority, you're just never going to get what it actually is.
Yeah, the biggest problem I see in counseling with couples is they got into marriage for the wrong reason.
Yeah.
So if you don't understand right out of the gate that the whole purpose of this is for you to be a visible demonstration of God's love for people,
Yes.
then you're going to put unrealistic expectations on your spouse and children. If you go into it, or you come to realize early on in marriage that the whole purpose of this is to demonstrate God's love for people, then you're going to really, really enjoy marriage because your expectations are going to be realistic.
Yeah. Well, here we are, one question in, and I've taken us in all kinds of different directions. So I'll get back to the roadmap. But on the second week of the podcast, we had one of our young, newly married staff members, Chapman Bean, talk about marriage. What do you think you got right early on in marriage, and then what needed course correction?
It's a great question. We surround ourselves with older couples right out of the gate. And every other week, we would take an older couple to dinner and ask them, what did you do well and what did you not do so well? And we heard some incredible practical wisdom and advice from those conversations that probably saved us a ton of heartache. Both of us were coming from different family experiences into marriage, but both of us realized we were unique, and this was an opportunity for us with a clean sheet of paper, because that's the way God, gives marriage. I mean, it's yours. You get to design how you want to interact with this person that you're committed to. So we wanted to just take our time and learn, and that was one of the best things we did. We prayed a lot. Prayer is a huge part of it. We serve together, so we have common ministry mindset. So the church really matters to both of us, and we want to, glorify Christ in the church and see it grow. Financially, we were realistic. I came here from Haiti. I didn't have any money. I didn't have any clothes, a car. I didn't have anything. She didn't either. So we both got jobs, and we decided to just live on my salary and save hers, and that set us up for a good run early on when we had kids, because we weren't dependent on this big salary. We just had mine to live off of, and we budgeted accordingly. I think things we didn't get right were, conflict resolution is just something that you kind of learn as you go. It's like you step in the ring and then the bell, and it's like, okay, what am I fighting here? And what are her strengths and fights and mine, and I think we learned that trial and error.
Yeah.
And there's some good in that, but, she would want to resolve the conflict quickly. I needed time to think about it. Otherwise, I would say stuff I later regretted. So we had to learn the hard way how to resolve conflict. I'd say one of the biggest things, too, is our friend group was way too big. And so we lacked some intimacy and depth in some of our relationships. And as we got into it a little bit more, we realized we just need a few friends. We can have lots of friends, but in terms of who we spend the majority of our time with, so we just started really investing in a couple of friendships, and they're lifelong friends to this date. So we're glad we did that. But those are things we had to learn along the way.
Yeah, it's, you start thinking in those categories, and there's like a million different things that start to come to mind. The next podcast had Gary Black, who you and I work really closely with.
Absolutely.
And are exposed to every day. And over 40 years of marriage there, and you kind of referenced this already, but what have you learned from older couples that have helped shape you as a husband?
I heard Billy Graham's wife say one time, she was interviewed, and it was a great question. They'd been married like 40-some years, and the guy said, have you ever wanted to divorce Billy? And Ruth Graham, this really staunch, just strong Christian woman, said, divorce? No. Murder? Yes. And I thought, that's a great line, because it gave me some hope. I thought even in that strong, public marriage that we saw from them, they had their ups and downs, and that gave me some hope. So they're the best teachers. The people that have been where you are and are further down the path than you are the best teachers. So, over the years from them, we've just heard a lot of things about encouragement. Like I had someone tell me one time, you can never encourage your wife too much. And that's huge, so anything she does really well, I don't want to just pass that opportunity. I want to verbalize it, and I want to do it in front of my kids. I want them to hear me complimenting and praising their mom, and even seeing me be affectionate with her. So there were things we learned that our parents maybe didn't do so well that we've tried to build on and even strengthen and do differently. I think when it comes to disciplining our kids, being on the same page.
Yeah.
We communicate before we go into the discipline situation. We try not to react. Now, we have had our weak moments where you just blow up, but overall, we've just kind of closed the door and said, okay, how do we want to handle this and what's the outcome? And man, that has helped us, because kids will pit parents against each other. An older couple said, we made a lot of mistakes early on because I favored this one and she favored that one. And so we learned from their mistakes what not to do. And that helped us on, the discipline front. I think I mentioned it, but the budgeting piece, finances can be a really big stressor in marriages. And so we've tried to take our time in making big financial decisions and living as simple as we possibly can. And having that lifestyle that you can actually sustain has been a huge thing that we learned from other people, because they would talk about how they got into debt, or they tried to take on more vacations than they could afford as they racked up, stuff on credit cards. We've just never lived that way, and that's been huge. I think probably the other big thing that we learned from my parents and from some other people we really admire is just eat together. And that's a simple rule, but man, we eat as many meals together as a couple and as a family as we possibly can, because that's where the conversation takes place.
Yeah, absolutely.
I could go on.
No,
I have
I'm
lots
with
of lessons.
You. Yeah. The eating together thing tends to be seasonal too. As kids get older, the challenges to it. Like right now, we're in the middle of it because of baseball and some things like that, where it's like, man, it's hard to get that time together, but boy, we miss it. And so, like, as we record this, it's raining outside, and I'm celebrating, because it's like we're gonna have some rainouts tonight, and we can sit around the table and enjoy each other. And I think that it's easy to get caught up in all these meals and minivans and at ball games and things like that, where you're not able to sit face to face. And that value is there's a lot of value there in being able to just spend that time together, because otherwise you find yourself trying to force conversations that will actually naturally kind of occur if you're just exposed to one another. And especially with introverted kids, and also with boys are shoulder to shoulder. If you're doing something with them, even if it's just eating, they're more likely to just talk to you than if you go, hey, we need to have a talk.
That's right.
That'll shut them down.
Out of nowhere.
That'll shut them down real fast.
Yeah, it's, over the years, those have been things that have been a blessing to us. One thing someone said to us recently that I found interesting, they said, we don't see you very often. And so I had to ask for clarification on that.
Mean?
Like, they said, we just don't see you out and about. Like, I've never bumped into you anywhere. And I'm like, it's fascinating, because you and I talk a lot about living a boring life, and we really do.
That's because you're not allowed on my front porch.
That's right. We just got to stay at our houses, and, it's not that we're reclusive. It's just that we really like being around our families. Yeah. And, I thought that's an interesting statement, because I'm really not out and about that lot. I just like being with Allison. And if I get to spend time with anyone, I want to be with her. And so some of the older couples I've really tried to pattern stuff after, it's about their friendship. Friendships are developed, they're grown. And so you have to be intentional, but the more you spend time with them, man, the better that friendship gets.
Yeah. You've had a good long run here at Southland, and so you've had the benefit of being with families through all kinds of different seasons. And so when you consider, the times where you've had to walk through with a spouse, the pain of losing a spouse, one of them sitting right over here, and we walked through his story on this podcast. And, you've walked through some unique circumstances. That's one of the most unique. What have you learned about spouses that, and this is it's hard to phrase this, but who grieve well versus those who don't? Are there some common characteristics or traits or things they do or don't do?
Yeah, you mentioned James and Lauren. I think we did his wedding. 19 days later, we were doing her funeral. And that was definitely tough. And we've seen a lot of those kind of tragedies around here. My parents were married 50 years, and my dad died. And the Bible talks about two people becoming one, and over time that happens. Yeah, it's very interesting. So when my dad died, it wasn't like another person died. It was like half of my mom died. And I remember asking her, "How are you?" And she said something I'll never forget as far as an analogy. She said, my heart has a hole in it, and the edges are really jagged and sharp. And
I've heard you say that to other people.
Yeah, and it came from her. And then 15 years later, if you asked her that question, she would say, well, the hole is still there, and the edges are just not as sharp.
Yeah.
So there's still something missing, and there's a deep sadness. So I think you have to admit that there's pain. A lot of people just act like, man, I got to be tough and move on. That's just not wise emotionally. Philip Yancey, one of our good authors that we can all read, said the Psalms are like a medicine cabinet. And you can go to the Psalms like on a day when you're sad, and you can find something that is emotionally medicinal for you. If you need comfort, it's in the Psalms. If you're happy and you don't have words to express how you're feeling, you can go there and find, again, emotional medicinal value that will help you know how to express your joy. So I've always steered people in times of sadness, especially relational sadness, to the Psalms, because David's very blunt and very honest. And he's lost a kid. He's, lost integrity, all kinds of situations that are common to man, but we tend to miss the practical nature of the Psalms. So usually people that do it well kind of line themselves up with Scripture and give themselves time to heal, because healing just doesn't happen overnight. You got to be patient. And it's important to have people that you can talk to and be honest about how you're really feeling. And I think in a lot of Christian communities, there's just not honesty. There's not vulnerability, and everything goes underground. And that's where anger and addictive tendencies take root, and all kinds of other stuff that can be highly destructive. It's already bad enough that you lost someone you care about. Now you're going to drink yourself to sleep every night, or you're going to binge eat and all these other things that people do when they don't know what to do with grief.
That's right. Well, we also had a podcast where we talked to my brother-in-law about substance abuse and addiction, and you've, again, walked through with so many different families, those types of circumstances. So when substance abuse or addiction of any kind are going on within a marriage, what have been the first steps you try to help both the person with the addiction and their spouse take?
Yeah, first thing is to be blunt and very honest with the person who's struggling with addiction, that this could lead not just to the end of your marriage, but to the end of your life.
Right.
So honesty is the name of the game there, and then getting them to actual practical help that they need. You have to be blunt. You have to draw some boundaries. I tell the spouse, let's not make any long-term decisions in the short term. So let's take divorce off the table for now. This is difficult. It's ugly. It's going to be messy. It hurts. But let's not walk out on the marriage quite yet. We might have to have a season of separation, and sometimes it's a very biblical response, like, until this person can restore trust and prove to you that they're worth bringing back into the house, let's move them out. Then you surround them with really good people that are committed to walking through this dark, difficult season with them. And that doesn't mean that there won't be divorce down the road, but if the person can get sober, get healthy, I've seen marriages get better, and God can do some amazing things. So that verse in Joel 2 that says that God can redeem the years the locusts have eaten. Locusts are destructive little insects.
Yeah.
They eat up everything that's alive and green. And if God can redeem those years that were damaging because of addiction, if that's a promise, and it is a promise, then I think we need to tap into that and invite God to really bring healing, but also take that marriage to the next place. Because, man, there's been so much damage. And again, we have couples. I mean, I look at them, you look at them every week when we're preaching, that they've walked through hell and back. And God's taken their marriage to places that it would never have gone if there hadn't been that valley experience. So I like to introduce them to those people and let them just share their stories, and that tends to breathe hope into their relationship.
Absolutely. I just preached at another church about a month ago, and one of the cool things when you and I do it, which is pretty rare, is that we get to brag on this place a little bit sometimes, and so one of the things I mentioned was what a clear value adoption is to Southland. And really, if you are a person who's just kind of new to the place and you walk around, it's not always self-evident, but there's some hints at it because you see families of different races, in our community, which is so cool. And it starts to kind of tip the hand, that there's something going on around here. There's some adoption stuff going on around here. You've been here again long enough to be able to tell the story. So why is that the case?
Yeah, so John 1, where it says that we're children not born of natural descent, but by the Father's will. So God chose us. He handpicked each of us and adopted us as sons and daughters into his family. So there's an adoption theme in the salvation narrative of the New Testament that you can't avoid. And so it makes sense to us that if that's what God's done for us, we're going to do it for every other person. And I remember reading some statistics about, children in the foster care system here in the state of Kentucky. And I thought, well, man, we can make a dent. We're a big enough community, we can make a dent. So I put out that challenge, let's adopt 1,000 kids in the next 25 years. And
what year was that roughly? Do you remember?
Man, 06,
ish.
05, somewhere in that ballpark. So I don't know where we are in that count, but my goodness, there's a bunch of families. Making a dent, international and regional, national adoptions, which has been fun. I witnessed it in my own family too. So, my parents took in refugees of war. So they didn't necessarily legally adopt kids, but we took in whole families that are like siblings to me and my brothers and sister. I mean, we would lay our lives down for these folks, and it's multiple Vietnamese families. On top of that, my parents were really kind of mentally and physically challenged adults. We took them to church on Sunday nights, and man, they're like family to me. So in a sense, we had this big adopted family that would show up at Christmas time and Thanksgiving, and my parents were just good to a lot of people that didn't have families. And the verse my mom always quoted was, God sets the lonely in families.
Yeah.
And I saw that, and I saw the value. Like, I just took for granted that every night I put my feet under a table and we laughed and we talked about happy and crappy. Those were our words, the good part of your day and the bad part of your day. And it was always fun to see these new people, even some of my friends that are in ministry today, because their families blew up, but my parents invited them to stay at our house for a season. Now I know, and that's what the picture of heaven is. Every nation, tongue, tribe, and people gathered around the throne. None of us would be there if Jesus, our older brother, hadn't made a way for the Father to adopt us into the family. So I think we just need to model that, quit making excuses. And, if your family's set up for it, and not every family is set up for it, you need to adopt. And we had dinner Wednesday night with a couple that, is fostering a little boy right now, and there's some tension in their home. They're trying to figure out, do we take the next step and adopt? And they've got some things they got to work through before they do that. But man, even in the fostering of this little kid, he's coming to life, and there's healing that's happening because he's never had a dad. Never had a dad. And man, it breaks my heart.
Yeah. We had Jason Eaton and Nate Head on here, and we could have had more. That was the thing, is like I joked on here about how we could have had Hatfield, but I don't want him on the podcast so often. And, but we could have had a lot of other people, not just on our staff, but within our church, to tell their adoption stories. And it's one of my favorite things about our church.
Yeah, abortion's so easy in our culture, and adoption's so difficult. And that's fascinating. So that's Satan's hand.
It's back to what you've already said about our view of children.
That's right. And so I think we ought to flip that and make adoption a little bit easier, at least financially for people, because it's so expensive, and the legal fees associated with it. So I think churches can step in and help cover the cost of some of those things.
We've talked about divorce a few different times so far, but, again, pastorally, you've walked through, the pain of divorce so many times. We had Kevin Comp on here, to talk about his story, God's redemptive story that involved divorce. Some listening right now, undoubtedly are pondering divorce. And without knowing the specifics, obviously, I'm asking you to speak in generalities, but what would you advise them with right now?
I think it's important to acknowledge right out of the gate that marriage is hard. It's very hard. We're both sinful people entering into a relationship where you spend all of your time together. So it's fraught with the possibility of all kinds of dangerous, difficult situations. There's a lie in our culture today that says that God wants me to be happy. And I think a lot of American Christians have bought into that lie. He never promised happiness. It's a byproduct of a lot of decisions we make. So in a lot of ways, we're in the driver's seat, on that. And I think what God really wants is for you to be faithful. And there's a lot of happiness that comes from faithfulness, but you don't know that you're faithful until you're about 30 or 40 years into it. So it's one of those long-growing fruits that just takes time. And there are going to be seasons that are more challenging than others. Your spouse is going to change over time, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. But they're definitely not going to be the same person you said I do to on your wedding day. So it's important to remember that. So I don't ever see divorce, or I shouldn't say ever, I rarely see divorce as a solution. It tends to complicate the situation and maybe make it a whole lot worse. So I want people to know that. So on the front end, when I'm coaching people or counseling people, I'm pretty blunt. I let them know, hey, your kids are probably going to have a challenge in, loving God, loving the church. Because of this is going to be their image of their view of God on a lot of levels, how you guys treat one another, how you react to this problem. But there are situations where divorce is probably the only option. I've seen that a handful of times. So I always challenge couples to apologize, forgive. It's amazing how much can be handled if people would just own what they did and the pain they caused, and then give it time to rebuild trust. And it's not easy. I get that. We have a memory, and it's hard to forget some things that people say and do to us. So, again, I don't want to simplify or minimize what people go through. I think divorce is such a quick, easy solution for some people, and I don't always see it as a solution.
Well, and sometimes solutions can be a solution that also creates new problems. And I think that's one of the things I've tried to tell people at times is there's no scenario in which you get divorced and there's just no cost to it. Right. And oftentimes people do tend to take the perspective of, we'll do this and everything will just get better. What for you, for the other spouse, for the children that are involved. And I've heard that said so many times, like, if we just get divorced, it'll be better for everybody. Well, define better, because you're not anticipating all the other problems that can come with this. I'm not saying that you may not have biblical grounds for it. I'm not saying that it might not be a solution to some things, but you have to at least acknowledge there's going to be, to your point, especially with kids, a cost there.
Yeah, one of the things I'll do is I'll ask a couple, will you meet with two other couples just for dinner? I'll buy the dinner. I'll pay for the dinner. Will you sit down across from a couple that's been through what you've been through and hear how they got through it? Because there are people, living testimonies in our church that I can point to and go, there is no reason they should still be together and thriving, but they are. And that's not always the case again, but there are those opportunities to help people get past what they're dealing with.
I have some really good friends who have been through just terrible seasons of marriage, and yet somehow they're still married. And the wife in that scenario, in one of the darkest points of their marriage, where she literally had every biblical justification to get married that you can name, her statement was, "Am I in a hurry to be divorced? Like tomorrow? Like, is there anything that's telling me I have to?" And you said this already. Let's try to take a long-term approach. You don't have to make these crucial decisions right now. Let's just sit for a bit. And so her idea was, I'm gonna give this at least a year. I'm not gonna make a decision to do divorce for years. There's separation. There's a lot of other things that happened, but she just decided, like, there's no one telling me I have to do this right now.
Yeah, you're in the driver's seat.
And their marriage is doing really well to this day, and they've got a bunch of kids. And so, and I could name more stories, and you could too, of people who've done exactly that, who've just decided to go, maybe God can and will redeem this if we'll just give it some time.
Yeah, my grandmother's a great example of this on my mom's side. I've shared this from stage, multiple marriages, and didn't come to faith in Jesus till later in life, and had a lot of regret. And she was the one that left those early marriages. So I also want to preach a message of hope and forgiveness. Like, if you've made mistakes and done dumb stuff and you're looking back on it with regret, man, don't wear a scarlet letter. Don't let the church pile on the shame. Jesus will definitely receive you and forgive you. So that's important too, to continue to, as you put truth there, to offer the grace. But in a situation where it's marriage conflict, I tend to lead with a lot of truth and bring the grace in, a little bit later.
You do more weddings than maybe almost anybody I know. You do a lot of weddings, man.
Weddings,
you do love weddings.
I love them.
You've got different vows that you've used in wedding ceremonies. So do I. Traditional marriage vows usually have some version of in sickness and in health. And Hatfield was on here to talk about that journey in their marriage, and as only he can, he demonstrated for me like what he does when he says that. Now he furrows that brow, looks right at
Gets serious.
right at him, goes in sickness and in health.
He's lived it.
He's lived it. And you have too. I mean, you've dealt with some sickness in your marriage and in your family, and so talk about how that's fleshed itself out, and what you've learned in your own marriage and in the marriage of others that you've walked through this with.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time in hospice care with a lot of families and been there when a lot of family members are saying goodbye to a loved one. I was with someone last night for 2 hours, and their dad is dying, and was coaching them, and he was still lucid, so I was talking to him. So I always remind people, everybody in your family is going to die eventually. So it's something you want to think about and be prepared for as best you can. When the moment comes, it's never easy. In my life, we had my mother-in-law living with us for better part of 3 years while she was battling cancer. My dad was dying in Missouri over the course of 7 years. So we were juggling a lot of this, but we were watching it play out in sickness and in health. We were watching, our parents struggle as their significant spouse, other was dying. So I've just had a front row seat to it, and it's hard, but it's also been really, really helpful, because what it's caused me to do is enjoy Allison. I've got her right now. She's not sick. She's not dying. I don't want to miss any opportunity I can, because I'm not promised that she won't get cancer or that I won't get cancer in the next 10 years. So I always encourage people, man, really enjoy the person while you got them and while we're all good. Don't let Satan steal memories. Our memories are really a gift from God, and in the moment when someone we do love dies, we tend to forget all these good things. So start thinking about it. Start talking about them. We have a living reservoir volume in our brain that can recall these wonderful memories, and it's important to reflect on those when things are going really, really well. And I'll never forget, there was a couple that had 6 kids, and the wife was diagnosed with cancer, and she was finally sent home, and so they put her in a chair out in the front yard, and they just invited the whole church to come and sing. She just wanted to hear singing, and so that's always been a good reminder to me. I watched her sit there and embrace her kids and weep, and her husband wept, but the church just sang. We kept singing. And I remember thinking, man, worship is a weapon in the face of death.
Yeah.
And singing gets us through a lot of difficult times. So songs are an incredible gift that God's given the community of believers that I think we need to tap into more. But there's no guarantee that you're not going to lose this person. At some point, they are going to die, and you're going to die. So I just, not to be a downer, I just think it's important that, on that wedding day, you remind them you have a person that you get to enjoy for however long God gives them to you. So really enjoy them.
Yeah, absolutely. I wish I would have done this differently when I was younger. I remember telling a friend of mine that I don't like stopping in the midst of a moment to take pictures. I just kind of like to let it linger and sit there. And in my mind, when I was young, I just burn that into my memory. Now the older I'm getting, the more I realize that I'm forgetting stuff. So I every now and then I'll just sit there and kind of scroll through my phone because I've got years worth of
pictures,
photos, that go back to, on the phone I have now, I think to 2011, and so I'll stop and just look at pictures of my kids or my wife or vacations or, sunsets, as I take so many pictures of that kind of thing. But it's really helpful to realize, like, man, those moments came and went, really far too quickly. And so when you're in one of those moments, which is literally available to us every day, to be able to enjoy one another, it's important to do just that, to enjoy them.
Well, you think about God's command in James where he talks about caring for widows and orphans. Part of the command is the benefit and blessing that the widows need. In that moment, they have needs that their husband's not there to provide, so the church needs to step in. But there's also the reciprocal benefit of the people who then serve them, because it's a reminder to them, you might be lonely someday. You might be alone someday. So I think the church has neglected that role a little bit, and we need to probably be more serious about that, because it helps us be reminded again that this is going to be my fate. I'm going to stand at a casket someday, or my wife's going to stand at a casket, and one of us is going to have to say goodbye. So before that day comes, let's do what you're talking about, which is let's live in the moment. Like, we're both rich men.
Yes, we are.
Not because we have big bank accounts, but because we have a reservoir of memories. We've been intentional about loving our wives and our wives and kids, and I think that's really important. And I don't lack. I don't have a lot of regret, because I've spent a lot of time with my family.
Yeah.
And so ton of memories there that I'm grateful for.
Yeah, I love the phrase, and it's repeated about 8 million times in Scripture, but the idea of rejoicing in the bride of your youth, and it's this, you were both once young, and standing up there bright-eyed and bushy-tailed with no earthly idea of what was coming your direction, but as you grow together and become one, you become resilient, and this may be a good place to land this podcast, but resilience is something our world needs. The ability to stand in the face of sickness, difficulty, pain, loss, all the things that we've talked about. Two really are better than one, and two becoming one, man, it's like, it's hard to describe, the level of strength that God infuses, into a marriage when two people are faithful to Him and faithful to each other. It's just a beautiful thing to be a part of.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we could go on all day, bro.
Absolutely.
We probably will. We'll do another one. But thanks for taking some time and coming down here and hanging out in the new man cave. So,
I love it.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So, hey, this is wrapping up the season of Locker Room. So we'll be back soon. Don't worry. Don't cry. It's okay for men to cry. But we'll be back soon, and share this season with anyone and everyone who you think would benefit from it. And we'll catch you next time. Later.